My name is Charles Galden, and I'm presenting today on the culture of El Salvador. El Salvador is located in Central America. It is bordered on its western side by Guatemala, on its eastern and northern side by Honduras. Its only port is bordered by Nicaragua. El Salvador has the distinction of being the only Central American country that has no Caribbean port. It is known as the land of volcanoes, and it also is frequently has earthquake tremors and or an earthquake in that portion of the Central America. There are many Spanish-speaking countries in the Western Hemisphere, and the smallest of those countries in the Western Hemisphere is El Salvador. It also quite naturally has a high population density with a population in excess of 6 million people. To give one an idea of this Central American country's size, we can compare it to the small New England state of Massachusetts. Both El Salvador and Massachusetts have approximately the same land mass of about 8,000 square miles, a very, very small land mass by many comparisons. The people of El Salvador are a mixture. They are a mixture of the indigenous people and the Europeans, and this process occurred over many centuries. In fact, they are called mestizos from the word mixed. Over 86% of the entire population of El Salvador identify themselves with this mixed population. The rest come from various parts of Europe, India, and other nations as well. We see that from the Pipil language, which is one of the indigenous peoples of El Salvador, a number of their loan words have found their way into the English language and are frequently used in the United States. Tomato, avocado, chili, and thank God, chocolate as well. We see that religion has a big influence on all cultures. We see that in El Salvador, the same is true. El Salvador has a rich history and a long history of Catholicism that goes back about 5 centuries. Most El Salvadorians identify with the Catholic faith. However, in recent decades, there's been a strong growth among evangelicals and Protestants. In fact, on an average weekend in church, there are more Protestants, evangelicals, attending church than there are in the Catholic faith. We see for this presentation that we're going to use Gert Hofstede's well-known cultural comparisons, and we're going to pull from his databanks on El Salvador and the United States, and his 6 cultural dimensions of power distance, individualism, masculine feminine, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation versus indulgence restraint. First, and perhaps one of the most influential, is the power distance. We notice that El Salvador has an extremely high score when it comes to power distance versus the United States, which has a very low power distance of 40. El Salvador has a strong remnant of the Spanish authoritarian rule that goes back, and also the hierarchical system that is within the Catholic Church versus the Protestant faith. One would find that this influences the business structure with a more top-down decision in most of the organizations of that country. We see another category is that El Salvador has a very low individuals score when it comes to individualism versus the staggeringly high number of individualism that is in the United States. In El Salvador, the group is more important than the individual. There's more of a group coordination. You'll see in public schools more uniform-based public school. Virtually 100% of it is that way. Communication is more indirect. Too direct communication is considered rude. There's an emphasis on networking. The family is the ultimate, and then the trust building is very important in this country. We see that in the scoring of masculine and feminine, El Salvador falls along the line of feminine nation. This simply means that there's more of a cooperative base in this atmosphere, an emphasis on modesty, fairness, less boastful culture as a whole. Also, on the cultural dimension of uncertainty avoidance, El Salvador has one of the highest scores possible for a country of 94 versus a very low score of uncertainty avoidance for the United States. In the United States, the low score manifests itself in that the U.S. is much more open to the new, the novel, progressive. In El Salvador, the emphasis is more on rules, structure, bureaucracy, and we see this in the business dress as well. The males would tend to frequently, you'd see, even though it's a tropical country, long sleeve shirts, ties, and business suits. We see the long-term orientation is not quite as dramatic between the two countries. El Salvador is considered a lower score than the United States. It has a greater respect for tradition, less on personal savings and family savings, an emphasis on quicker results as a result of their low long-term orientation comparison. We see that when it comes to indulgent comparison, El Salvador has a score of 89, which is higher than the United States. They enjoy their life. They enjoy gathering for fun, for birthday parties, weddings, and many other aspects. They tend to view life optimistically. They enjoy their leisure and their vacations, and the family is to be celebrated. We see that we can, from the conclusions of the scoring of Gert Hofstede's comparison of cultural dimensions, we can make some conclusions in three major categories. First, we're going to look at the category of communication. It's important for one coming in from the U.S. to El Salvador to be very clear in their directives. For in El Salvador, it has a high power distance score, and it's much more top down, and so directives tend to be very, very clear in such a structure, and that would be what they would be accustomed to. On the personal, interactive, social communication, however, one would need to be very careful not to be too direct or harsh with an El Salvadorian. One could be much more direct in the United States, but in El Salvador, too direct a communication could be considered rude. And in El Salvador, there's less emphasis on being boastful, and so a leader coming in, he or she would need to be very careful about that, for if they were boastful, it could be frowned upon and could hurt their position of leadership. We see when it comes to motivation, there are some significant differences that we can conclude here. First is that one would discover coming into El Salvador, as far as motivation, there tends to be a more measured sense of motivation. And this may stem from a number of factors. In El Salvador, one can only purchase so much land. There's not a lot of land in the country. The amount of land that a business or an individual can own is limited. Whereas in the United States, the sky is the limit. Go for the gusto is kind of the concept. In El Salvador, the population density, the land mass, the lack of a Caribbean port, etc., has created a certain boundary that one would encounter that influences their motivation. But the family and relationships is a very strong part of their motivation. And an outsider coming in from the U.S. would need to be aware that the motivational factors of the family and relationship would probably be even higher in El Salvador than the U.S. However, the charismatic or charisma or strong visionary aspect of leadership is well received in El Salvador. The sense of vision, goal setting, a strong leader would be well received coming into the country as long as it is tempered with other factors. Finally, the third category and last one we're going to look at is teamwork. One would find that in El Salvador, much larger, stronger hierarchical system than the U.S. As we've already talked about boundaries, one would also find that in El Salvador, they work well in teams, but the boundaries need to be clearly laid out, what they are working on within those boundaries. The temperament analysis and cultural dimensions of the El Salvadorians is they work well within groups, they value the groups, and there's a natural warmth in the people, and they can work well together. The caution is the leader would have to be very clear, the boundaries clearly set, and the positive results would be well received in El Salvador. We can make a number of summary points about El Salvador. First is the common connection between El Salvador and the United States are many. El Salvador is on the U.S. dollar and currency. Their constitution is very similar. Their structure of government is very, very similar to the U.S. And so one would find a lot of common connections. As far as leadership, though, one would find a bigger difference in that there's a stronger top-down emphasis of leadership. Being rude to a superior or boss would be frowned upon in that culture. One would need to have respect for authority. And finally, motivation, one would encounter coming in from the United States, perhaps to draw wrong conclusions that the El Salvadorians are not as motivated as the U.S. It's more of a boundary structure that has been imposed upon them just quite naturally with land, population, many other things. But a wise leader can find ways to adjust to that and intersect with that and learn how to touch those motivational points. With that in mind, we can give a number of biblical points as admonitions, one from the Old Testament book of Proverbs and one from the New Testament book of Colossians. First, from the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, chapter 20, verse 5 says, "Purpose in a person's heart is like deep water, but an understanding person can draw it out." Here's another way of saying this, and purpose, which has to do with motivation. The motivation in a person is like deep water, but a good leader, he or she can learn to draw it out of people. As far as the New Testament, a good passage to conclude with here is Colossians 4, verse 6. "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each one." The El Salvadorian people will respond to pleasant language that is graceful and respectful. It will be well received in that country. Here are a number of the references and images and many other aspects that came to form this presentation.